Hi folks, I'm Gheeotine and welcome to Minimum Spec Gaming, the game and tech show where we both review the game and the lowest hardware recommendations as stated by its sales page. Today we look at the second entry in Rockstar Games' beloved Wild West series, Red Dead Redemption 2. Red Dead Redemption 2 released in 2018, and in a move that infuriates those of us that believe in numbered sequels also standing for a chronological sequence in which a narrative experience occurs, is a prequel to 2010's Red Dead Redemption. When the f*** did 2 come before 1? Numerical quibbles aside, this left me with a concern starting out. That being prequels are very often a narrative dead end. A story with an ending that is already predetermined that you cannot mess with to a certain degree, and therefore you can only do so much interesting stuff with. Fortunately, it's probably been over a decade since I played the first game, and the passage of time has eroded all but the biggest plot points and the most important characters from my memories. That said, you start the game in medias res as Arthur Morgan, member of the Van der Linde gang, as he and his cohorts are fleeing in a snowstorm in the Wild West from a botched robbery. Narratively, this sequence establishes the precarious position in which your gang exists and the reliance that the other members all have with you. It also serves as the opening gameplay tutorial to lay out various mechanics, of which there are many, more so than I could easily go into this style of review, such as horse care, gun maintenance, appearance tied back to subtle in-game behaviors, game hunting, bounty hunting, crafting, and so much else. Red Dead Redemption 2 is an expansive, immersive, and almost painfully detailed narrative experience. That is, so long as you stick to the path that the game sets out for you. The opening sequence alone takes a few hours to lead you by the nose from event to event. That's not to say you won't eventually have the freedom in a wide sandbox map with numerous side quests, collectibles, and secrets to discover. It's just that the game decides at certain points when and how you can engage with it. I've had sequences where I seemingly let a gameplay portion play out a bit too organically, and the story decided it couldn't compensate and game overed my ass to send me back to a checkpoint and be like, now do it properly this time. The game to a certain degree is at its best for me when I'm allowed to explore, to drink in the wild countryside and allow the atmosphere to wash over me. Comparatively, the game seems at odds to this notion if you want to advance the plot of your crew just trying to find a way to get by in this world that they find increasingly difficult to exist in. Speaking of which, that's one of the aspects of Rockstar games that often becomes the make or break detail for me: the writing. Whether it's story or characters, Rockstar puts an incredible amount of work into their story and characters, for better or for worse. I say for better or for worse because the writing, as enriching as it is to relay emotion and personality, is what turned me off to Grand Theft Auto 5. i.e., I hate that game's protagonists. That's another discussion for another review, but the point I'm getting at is that the people are well crafted and fleshed out enough to get me invested in them, whether positively or negatively, as the group tries to find a place for itself. Besides specific story details, one of the main ways you're set to make progress is to fatten the coffers of your band's camp, and this is where the emphasis is put on you to explore and engage with the open world aspect. All you need to do is make money.
I'm here for money. Money.
Will you do that by being honorable and taking honest work, or will you rob, steal, murder, and swindle every chance you get? It is up to you, and while I have taken a few side quests and jobs, I find myself making plenty in just looting the bodies of those that I just happen to keep getting into gunfights with, ensuring I never run dry on healing items or ammo. All details aside, I'm enjoying the game. I'm probably going to keep playing, but I'm doing so on machines that are more than well equipped enough to handle this kind of software to the point of overkill. I mean, my Steam box is maxed out and running at about 90 FPS. That said, if you're interested in a game like this and just want a machine to try it on a basic level, what can you get away with technically? Well, before we get into any kind of actual hardware, we have to call out Rockstar for a thing or two. One is tying their games to a proprietary launcher in addition to Steam. Fuck any company who does this. The fewer barriers between me and the game, the better. Additionally, while small, any programming weight is a detriment when you're running on low-end hardware. That out of the way, let's turn to the Steam listing and see what parts the store page says you can get away with. According to the minimum system requirements, Red Dead Redemption 2 is conveniently specific in its part designations, with an i5-2500K or FX 6300 for a CPU, an NVIDIA GTX 770 with 2GB, or an R9 280 with 3GB for a GPU, and last but certainly not least, 8GB of RAM. Actually, let's cover the RAM situation first. When looking at the minimum specs and doing testing, there are two primary standards I hold to what makes a playable experience: consistent frame times, and an average of between at least 24 and 30 FPS. Resolutions can be flexible so long as the game can support it. I say all this because 8GB of RAM is not a sound recommendation for a minimally spec'd machine. In the first iteration of the test bench, I built it exactly to the recommended parts. An i5-2500K, a very nice looking GTX 770, and 8GB of DDR3 memory. Using the built-in benchmark, the game mostly ran fine up until the final inner-city shootout sequence. Once it got there, it would hitch up frequently, as the game, when unconstrained, will use up to about 12GB, and since the base machine didn't have that much, it had to stutter and shuffle data around before it could continue. Otherwise, the game showed it was still supported and playable as far as other parts were concerned. So that's one area where the game's store page needs correction. Up the RAM to 16GB. That being said, once we did throw in 2 more sticks, the game became much better. It averaged out to about 35 FPS at 720p. Granted, everything else needed the absolute lowest settings to be within VRAM constraints, save for 1 or 2 sliders regarding textures or shadows you could raise a single notch. But it was playable. I also got an error message saying that the GTX 770 needed newer drivers, in spite of the fact I was on the last drivers that the 770 received. That being said, as was requested in Silksong, let's try and go lower. To keep part swapping easier in the early stages, I decided to go with a downgrade for the GPU. I stayed in the GTX 700 series and got my hands on a 750 Ti. The GTX 750 Ti on average has just about a third of the necessary computing bits of the GTX 770, but the same amount of VRAM. I did try out a 730 with a dying fan, but that averaged out just barely within a double-digit frame rate.
I feel like this GT 730 wants to die.
So that one would be a hard no. But back to the 750 Ti. Surprisingly, in spite of how cut down it was compared to the 770, the 750 Ti managed to squeeze out a frame rate of almost exactly 30 FPS. Based on the current performance, I think this is just about where we should stop for GPU. But what about CPU? For the sake of keeping things relatively simple today, we're going to stick to Sandy Bridge generation CPUs, 2nd gen Intel Core series. That said, let's start by sticking with a couple facets of the 2500K, which has 4 cores and 4 threads, a base clock speed of 3.3 GHz, a 6MB cache, and a 5 GB transfer per second bus speed. I was going to try and find the weakest 4-core i5 Sandy Bridge CPU, but in my research and acquisition process, that one actually came out as unreasonably expensive compared to other options, so we're going to try out the i5 2400S. It's not too different from the 2500K, with a base clock being about 800 MHz slower and a lower power draw. That said, how does the machine compare when running the 2400S? Honestly, not that much. If anything was noticeably different, it was just the load times. They weren't that egregious, but it was definitely longer. All said and done though, the frame rate only dropped about 2.5 FPS. Still playable by my previous metrics, so let's go even further. Let's keep the 4 threads, but drop to half the cores. Let's go close to the bottom of the Intel Core series. Let's go to the i3 2100. First, let me say that this was the performance level where I started having issues with just trying to get the game to run. Initial testing had me subtly crashing in loading screens. Speaking of loading screens, this was rather bad. From clicking on the Red Dead Redemption 2 icon to letting the Rockstar launcher process and being able to access the main menu took 4.5 minutes. 4.5 minutes! But it did eventually get there. As far as the bench test, while this might be playable for some, this is where it fell just shy of the bare minimum of 24 FPS. Funnily enough, I did throw the 770 back on with the i3, and it did drag the average back up, but if you're opting for an i3, then I doubt you have the extra few dollars to spring on the slightly better GPU. That said, let's look at the recommended minimum, the minimum we got away with, and their respective prices. Looking at the cost of these respective parts, if you're looking for bargains and a good entry level, these are a great place. Bear in mind, the CPUs were all buy it now on eBay, so if you can find the rare auction with these, then you may be able to come in lower. But the i5 2500K was just shy of $10. The i5 2400S was less than half of that at $4, and it actually came in cheaper than the i3, which was just under $6. Now, that's not accounting for shipping, but for what we spent, that's a pretty good value prospect. Now, when it comes to the GPUs, these were all auctions, and therefore took some work, monitoring, and diligence to get my hands on. If you don't have the patience for eBay, you can buy it now for both cards for between $20 and $30. But if you do know the ways of eBay, you can find great deals. Not accounting for shipping, the 750 Ti cost $7.50. I only just registered that coincidence. Anyway, and the 770 was only $3 more at $10.50. With a CPU and GPU combo coming in easily under 20 bucks, you have a fantastic entry point into PC gaming. As far as Red Dead Redemption 2's minimum specs are concerned, here's the recommended changes for the minimum requirements for a playable experience. For the CPU, broaden the scope and lower a little bit to a 4-core CPU with a 2.5 GHz clock speed. You could specify the 2400S or similar, but I've seen the game running on 1st gen Intel Core CPUs, so an LGA 1156 board could be worth looking into in future. I did also test the R9 280, but I couldn't get my hands on other lower tier cards from AMD to compare in time. All that said, 2GB of VRAM and a 50 class card from the 700 series or newer and equivalent would be a good way to mark the minimum playable hardware. And as mentioned before, make sure you have 16 gigs of RAM. Finally, let's call out 5 other great games you could theoretically play on today's minimum spec machine. Hollow Knight Silksong, Half-Life 2, Spiritfarer, Wreckfest, and the Metro Redux collection. Now there's a pretty solid opening library if I've ever seen one. If there's another game that you want to see me do next, or if there's a suggestion to improve this video format, then sound off in the comments. I'd love to hear ya. Later! Hey, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end. Remember that I give away Steam keys with my regular weekly uploads, and all you have to do to enter is leave a comment and have contact info on your YouTube profile. But as always, thanks for watching and keep your head on your shoulders.